Okay, so software development process, who makes up a software development team, how do we follow the process, and what tools do we use? So the software development process involves a lot of steps and a lot of people. It's not just write some code and ship it. At a high level, we get requirements first, and from those requirements, who are from the client, the person that we're making the software for, we come up with an architecture and design for what we're going to build, and we make sure that we address the problem that we're trying to solve and address the requirements given by the client. Once we have a fairly solid idea about the architecture and design, we can start to write some code. Then we do some code review and we test. Now testing is over here past code review, but really we'll talk another day soon about test-driven development and how sometimes we want to consider testing. I won't say always, I want to say always, but a lot of times we want to consider testing before we even write code. We want to at least consider it because you want to make sure the code that you write is testable so that it's modular and clean. But generally, this is just a general process. We code, we have a code review, we test our code, and when we feel good about the tests, then we can release it to the customer. Who's involved? So requirements are determined by the stakeholders. The stakeholders are the people who have an interest in this piece of software, the people that you're doing it for or who are paying for it. And that is going to include your client as well as the people who are paying you, who are paying to develop the software. So the client and the product manager, your team lead, those people are stakeholders, and they determine together what the requirements for the product are. The architecture, design, code review, and test, that's done by developers. Okay? Sometimes these developers are QA engineers. They're QA quality assurance testing engineers. A lot of times those lines are blurred, so we just say that they're developers or engineers. Those are the people who are involved with writing the code, reviewing the code, designing the code, and testing the code. And then release. In most cases, there's an operations team. It depends on how big the company is and how big the product is and how many clients there are. But in a lot of cases, there's an operations team, even if it's one guy, a girl, that will deploy the release and the updates. But if you're developing for a small team or yourself, it could be you. So that means that as a developer, even if you do have an operations team, you need to be aware of DevOps, which is short for developer operations. So this is things like how do we deploy the software? How does the client access the software? How do we store the data? And how do we maintain the data? And how do we maintain the releases? And how do we release updates? And all those questions you also need to be concerned about as a developer. So there's a lot involved, a lot more than just writing some code and being familiar with the language and knowing how to use VS Code and knowing how to use Git. There's a lot more to it than that. And we're going to touch on most of these things, if not all of them, at least slightly in this course, okay? Because there's a lot more to being a developer than just writing code. So how do we follow the process? There's so many different approaches to implementing the software development process, as you can imagine probably. There's so much to it, so there are lots of different ways that people do it. We'll talk about two general high-level project management methods. One is called waterfall. Waterfall is the traditional way of developing software, which is characterized by being well-defined but rigid. And the other way is agile. You've probably heard both of these terms before, but you might not know exactly what they mean. Agile is a newer way. It's not very new anymore, really, but it's a newer way, developed in 2001. 2001 is much longer ago than I'd like to admit at this point. And it's an iterative process that's characterized by flexibility and continuous incorporation of client feedback. So very different ways of doing things. In this course, we'll teach and use agile methodologies because it's largely what's used in industry today due to its advantages. So we're going to have a closer look at both of these. So the waterfall method, which is what I used, by the way, for the first 15 years of my career, because I worked on an operating system, and sometimes the waterfall method makes more sense. In some cases it does. So the team that I worked on, we had hundreds of developers across the world that worked on the operating system. And the changes that we made had tremendous impact. So this operating system had been out in the world for a long time, and the operating system I worked on was used in high-performance computing applications, which means that either people's lives depended on it working well, or companies would lose billions of dollars when it didn't work well. So we had to be super careful about any changes that we made in the operating system, and that meant we took a very cautious approach to development, and we didn't make decisions quickly about what we were going to change and how. And in that case, because of the size of the team and the sensitivity of what we worked on, we used a waterfall project management paradigm. We tried to switch to agile at the end of my time working on that product, and it did not go well. It was not a good idea. It was very hard to try to fit it into that model, and it was just mostly, I think, because it was a buzzword, and there were these perceived benefits, but it just doesn't always work. So in waterfall, all the requirements, the designs, the schedules, and the expected end products are agreed upon firmly between the development team and the client before any development begins. Before we write a single line of code, we map out exactly when it's going to be delivered and exactly what we're going to deliver. The pros are that as a developer, you know exactly what you have to produce before you even start, because you work with completed designs and well-defined expected results. And that is kind of warm and fuzzy. You know, it's kind of nice to have that kind of certainty before you start writing code. As a project manager, you have a clear idea of when the completed product will release because everything is well and completely documented. For the client, they know what they're signing up for and what they're going to get at the time that they agree to pay for it. The cons is it takes much longer to get something out because there's so much planning and documentation required up front. So our planning and documentation cycle lasted about 3 to 6 months. So before we started working on a particular iteration of the release, somebody is working on the planning and documentation requirements and design for 6 months prior to that. Okay? When problems happen, and they will, there's little or no room to recover, which often leads to delivering late or delivering with less than you said that you were going to deliver, which means you need to renegotiate the contracts with those clients. And so it never works out as cleanly as you plan for it to work out. Things happen, they come up, things you don't anticipate, changes in the technology, changes in what the client wants, changes in what the resources available on the team. All sorts of things can change over that long a period of time, as you can imagine, that compromise your ability to deliver exactly what you said. So you rarely, also, this is a big con, you rarely deliver what the client actually wants, even though it's what they thought they wanted, and no one knows until the end. So there's this, ongoing issue where a client who doesn't have an understanding of technology says, this is what we want. And then as a developer, you have an interpretation of that, and you make it. And then you show it to the client, and they're like, that's not what I want. And then you say, but this is what you said you wanted. And they're like, that's not what I said I wanted. That's not at all what I wanted. The downfall is that you've made it.
It happens all the time.
It does. It does, invariably, and it's the biggest con. It's the biggest con because if you don't make what the client wants, then they probably won't pay for it, or if they've already agreed to pay for it up front, they're not going to pay to renew the license. They're going to go look for another solution. So that's a huge con.
And there's some software development companies that sort of say, we're just an agile Scrum kind of company, or we're just this, or we're just that. And like in our studio, we pick a different project management methodology per project because every project requires a different way to run it.
Yes.
So,
absolutely. And what you'll find is that it is a huge spectrum. It's not like, a company always uses this, or you can't even say like for this kind of project we always use this. It's going to change, and it'll even change like, between teams working on across projects in a company. There will be, things that teams are comfortable with, ways that they work best together. There'll be differences dictated by the client that you're working with. So,
and that's kind of decided up in the planning of the project at the start.
That's right.
How are we going to do this best?
Yes. How are we going to manage this project? How are we going to make sure that we deliver what the stakeholder wants, and how are we going to do it on time with the resources we have? It's the most important part of the process, is getting that worked out from the start. And when you do your project assessments that you work on teams with, we will reiterate over and over that you need to work that stuff out first as a team. You need to decide, how are we going to work with source control? How are we going to know who's working on what? What are we going to do when something throws our scope out? Whether it's we didn't realize we were going to have to do that, and now we've got to fit in an extra 20 hours of work somewhere, or somebody gets sick and we suddenly have one less person to work on something. You have to work out as a team, how are you going to manage those things to make sure that your work gets done on time, delivering what you say you're going to deliver. So Agile project management is an iterative approach to development where work is broken down into user stories. A user story is of the format: user A, some user, does action B to get a result C. And so a user story might be let's say we're building an app where you can connect with dog walkers or something, right? And so you'd say a person with a dog can register as a user of the application in order to use the service. Okay, so that's a user story. So you've got to implement your product such that people with dogs can register to use your app. That's one user story. So these user stories are broken down at that granularity, very small granularity, and those are released to the client as soon as they're done. So as soon as you provide those chunks of functionality, as soon as those are coded, and different teams will have different ideas about how big those chunks should be, and that'll probably depend on the project. So you might say a user story should take less than 2 hours to implement. Or you could say a user story should take less than a day to implement. So those kind of guidelines for how long this chunk of work should take is something you would agree on as a team. And when that thing is done, the idea with Agile is that you show it to the client and say, okay, this part's done. Do you agree that this is what you need? And then they agree, or they say, actually, when a user registers, I want them to be able to put in a nickname too. So can you add a nickname field to the registration? Or we don't really need all of their, we should make this piece of information optional. Or we should make this piece of information required, or things like that. Okay, so they'll talk through with you when you show it to them, and you'll take that feedback and then agree to make changes or not based on your scope and so forth. So the pros of an Agile project management process is that as soon as the basic requirements are understood, you can start coding and providing something to the client. You don't work out the whole entire thing at the start. You get a rough idea of what you're making from start to end, but you don't define out every detail like you do in waterfall, or attempt to. You get the big picture, and then you start to break it into chunks, and as soon as you have some chunks that you need to deliver as a part of this product, then you can have people start to work on it. There's less formal documentation, and coders like that. We hate writing documentation. So when in a waterfall approach, we would have, this really rich and exact documentation, and developers would have to contribute to that, and nobody liked doing that stuff. So there's less formal documentation. It's much quicker to write up. Biggest pro, you're more likely to produce what the client actually wants. And that should be clear, right? Because it's this iterative process. Each time you make something, you bring it back to the client and say, is this what you want? And they're agreeing with you or disagreeing with you all along the way. So at the end, there's not this big surprise like, oh, that's not what I wanted at all. They've agreed to it all along. The cons is that for the developer and the client, it can feel chaotic if it's not well managed. Okay, it has to be really well managed. Otherwise, you're not going to meet the schedule, and what you actually think you're working on, you won't be sure of all along the way. So it's got to be really well managed. And it also gives the client license to change their mind. Like, you're agreeing up front that, okay, the client may not agree to what we show them, which can result and unplanned rework, and exploding scope and cost. So you have to manage the client's expectations also about what you're willing to change or not change. You can't just show the client and everything that they say they disagree with. You're not necessarily going to be able to say, okay, sure, we'll do that. Okay, sure, we'll do that. Because you'll run out of time. All right? So there's a little bit more management that's required throughout the entire process with the client. So that, for an introvert, isn't pleasant sometimes, right? So that's a con.
Yeah, it sucks when you spend ages doing something and then they go, oh, actually, now that I've seen it, no, how about we do it this way?
Yes. And then you might have to say, actually, it's going to take, 40 hours to make that change, and we don't have that room in the schedule. So if you want us to make that change, then we can't do A, B, and C anymore.
Gives you a chance to interject.
Yes. But you have to be comfortable doing that, right? And as an introvert, you may not be comfortable doing that. You may want to be like, oh, I'll just agree because I don't want to talk about this. It's really hard. And then, you go back and you're totally stressed because there's no way you can get it all done. So that part of it's more challenging. So it's just good to identify on your team who's the person maybe that can have those difficult conversations with the client and not be bothered by it. Hopefully there's somebody extroverted enough on your team that they're willing to do that. It's always a benefit to have an extrovert in the mix. Okay, so the tools that we use. In this class, we'll use Trello. Has anybody used Trello before? Okay, cool. So Trello is nothing hard to use. It's a free tool. Like everything, it has paid options. We'll use the free one. And it's used to do project management. So we'll have a quick look at it maybe today and maybe not. Jira is Atlassian's tool. I think I'm saying that word right. Atlassian. Gosh, every time I put the A in the I in the wrong place.
Two guys from Melbourne.
Atlassian. My brain does not want to remember that word, so I'll say it wrong every time. Atlassian has some software called Jira, and it's really good software, and the licenses are not cheap.
No,
so what you'll find is that like enterprise companies and larger companies that can afford it will use Atlassian Jira. Yes. Yeah. Did they? Right. So, but Trello's it's like the cheaper little brother. So you can have a paid use of Trello, but it's much cheaper than Jira. Jira's much more than what Trello is. Jira's it's got a programmable interface that's vast, and you can
get up to $400 or $500 per person per month or something.
It's really expensive.
You can get to tens of thousands of dollars.
Yes. It's really expensive. It's what we used at SAP when I worked there, and it is a really nice tool because we did issue management in it. We did source control. Well, not source control. We used Git for that at the end. But you can easily link tickets to stuff that's in your repository. You can do that a little bit with Trello. It's just not nearly as feature rich. You can also do project management in Jira. So there's an agile plugin, and there's a portfolio plugin, and you can use that so that you can have all these different views of the project, all using this one Jira tool.
I find Trello's a lot more flexible because it's just a Kanban kind of board. You can do kind of whatever you want on it. Jira's very kind of structured in terms
very structured.
How you use it, and that's what's suited to larger enterprise companies because they have a very structured kind of model.
Exactly right. So in Jira, you can define exactly what fields you want in a ticket and exactly how you want to structure those things, and then you force everybody to use it. You can also very well define the process to move a ticket from one state to another, and so you force people to go through those steps, and so that that people are following the same steps. Trello's much looser, and you just kind of have to agree how everybody's going to use it. You can't really enforce it. So
we use Trello to run everything on all of our projects.
Yes, and I think it's super common for small, medium businesses to use Trello.
Yeah.
So I think it's useful for you guys to learn Trello. And if you find that you're using Jira, they'll train you. They'll train you on how to use it, and you'll be fine. Lots of different source code repositories. We'll use Git and GitHub in this class. At SAP, we used GitHub at the end, but we used Perforce for a long time. So it's again, Perforce is more of an enterprise level kind of tool. The licenses are really expensive, and it's a really nice source control solution, but it's not cloud-based. I don't know if they have a cloud-based solution. So we actually had the source control servers. We maintained those. Our operations team maintained those source control servers. It wasn't cloud-based. Collaboration. So you have to collaborate with your team. We'll use Slack in this class, and Slack is used like almost everywhere now. Even at SAP, we started using Slack for collaboration. All right, so any questions about that project management stuff? Is that pretty good? So these slides, I put the link in there. I have recorded this, so I'll post the video so that you can watch the video later if you want to. We're going to get lots of practice with this process. We'll go over bits and pieces of it again, especially when you get assigned a project assessment. We'll look at Trello together. There's also, some people are very physical and like to use physical Trello boards, physical Scrum boards, so Post-its on a wall.
It's like Trello is like Post-its.
It is. So Trello is like Post-its, electronic Post-its. So some people actually like to use physical Post-its. And I've worked on teams that did that too. They just had like a big wall, and they put Post-its up, and moved them around and put their names on them and so forth. So that's another way that you can do things. So we won't look at it now because it's already 11:15, but we'll have a look in the near future. We'll have a look at Trello and how we can use it, and you'll get lots of practice and experience with it. All right.